attends quelque chose, Michel?
Hein?
Tu attends quelque chose? Simplement demander ce que
Ah bon, c'est là-bas que ça va se passer?
Non, non, c'est ici, mais c'est la présentation d'abord officielle.
Et après, vous allez...
Après,
Arrêtez tout.
on arrête pour une minute pour que les gens qui vont parler, ce soit
Ah
ici.
bon, alors,
soit...
d'accord, on commence.
Oui, tout le monde.
Est-ce qu'on peut commencer? Can we begin?
Okay.
The subject that was assigned to me, Ukrainian writers and the famine, has two aspects. One, of course, is the aspect which comes to mind first, how the subject of the famine has been treated in Ukrainian literature. The other aspect, which perhaps less readily comes to mind, is the question of how Ukrainian writers, primarily in Carynnyk in 1932 and 1933, perceived the events that were unfolding around them, how they responded to these events, and how those events influenced their writing. This second aspect, this less obvious aspect, is almost completely unexplored. I'll come back to it in a minute. The first aspect, Ukrainian writers in the famine, or the treatment of the famine in literature, is of course a very broad field. We have today a substantial body of literature, almost all of it in Ukrainian, treating the events of the 1930s from a literary point of view. The names here are obvious: Vasil Barka, Burhart, and a number of others. This literature begins to merge gradually with the body of eyewitness literature that exists. And so there are a number of writers who take their own experiences and treat them in a more or less fictional form. And some of the accomplishments in this field are quite striking, although they are little known. One writer who comes to mind here is Halina Krus, who, on the basis of her own experience, has written very moving, very effectively handled little stories. And I'm not certain whether they should be classified as eyewitness accounts or as literature. There is, as we know, a literature of the Holocaust, a very substantial, a very large body of writing. On its basis, there has developed a secondary corpus of literature, literature about the Holocaust, literature about the literature of the Holocaust. In the Ukrainian case, there is no such secondary literature. Vasil Barka's novel has not been studied by literary critics, as far as I know. None of the other major achievements of the Ukrainian literature on the famine have been studied by literary critics. And if this symposium were to set about the task of drafting a list of the many, many questions that have to be answered by future researchers, then I think this question of developing a critical literature on the literature of the famine would have to come somewhere near the top of the list. The other aspect, the aspect of what happened to the writers in Kharkiv, has been dealt with to some extent. The primary sources here are, of course, Carynnyk and Lovrinenko and Hayholovko, all of whom witnessed those events and have written about them in their memoirs. These eyewitness accounts present a number of difficulties. To take only one example, a question that has interested me very much is the last days of Mykola Luhovy. And in this case, we have various eyewitness accounts of his last days, starting with Arkady Lyubchenko and his story, or his memoir, Yoho Tajemnica, his secret. We have the accounts of Carynnyk and Kostyuk and Lovrinenko, but there are internal contradictions. And so, for example, we still do not know, perhaps we never will know, what was the exact text of the suicide note that Luhovy left on May 13th, 1933. It does seem to me, however, that this task too should receive a very high priority, and that if we are to understand the catastrophe of the early 1930s, we should give as much attention to what was happening in the cities, and especially in Kharkiv as the capital and the cultural and intellectual center at that time, as to what was happening in the countryside. Very little work has been done here, and it is high time that a good deal more was done while the material can still be saved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carynnyk. Now we have some 30 minutes left for discussion and questions. I invite you to address yourself directly to the speakers. First question.
I have a question for Marko Carynnyk. I've come across references myself in the Soviet-Ukrainian Samveda literature to Holod, but again, I haven't looked at this literature in a consistent fashion with respect to mentions of or discussions of Holod. I was wondering if you could comment on the extent to which this literature shows an interest in Holod, any kind of perceptiveness about it. Simply, what does the Ukrainian Samveda literature of the 60s and 70s say about Holod? I wonder if you have any comments.
This is a question that Nina Strakata-Karavanska would be more competent to handle than I. I have seen the Samveda literature that mentions the famine, beginning with Dzyuba and his discussion of the subject in Internationalism czy Rusyfikacja, and continuing through to Rudenko and the 7th and 8th issues of the Ukrainsky Vysnik. These references are, with the partial exception of Dzyuba, these are passing references. It is clear from them that there is a perception, there is a memory of the famine in Ukraine. I do not think that this Samveda literature is particularly valuable for understanding the famine. What Rudenko says about the famine is no more or less authoritative than what has been said by people living here. In some cases, as we find here in the West, the estimates given of the number of losses are obviously arbitrary. The ideological interpretations are obviously as heavily influenced by various perceptions which have little to do with genuine historiography as they are here. It would be an interesting question to summarize all this literature in all the references to the famine in Samveda, but it's not a particularly promising field unless there are genuine pearls in Samveda which have not reached the West. Russian literary works on this subject are far less numerous than Ukrainian, but Grossman's novel is a major addition to the literature. It was mentioned here yesterday. The book has remained very little known in the West, perhaps because it appeared in a very poor English translation. Beyond that, in Russian unofficial or samizdat literature, there is very little. There has been a few things have been published officially in the Soviet Union in Russian. An author whom Suchasnis discussed is Yakimenko. And I, by oversight rather than intention, did not mention the literature of the late 1920s and early 1930s. There is a vast body of second-rate literature which could be analyzed the way, say, Vera Dunham has analyzed the Stalinist literature of the 30s, not for its literary value, but for the patterns, the social patterns that it shows. During the 20s, a good deal was published, journalistic accounts, novels, short stories about rural life. Many writers were assigned to go into the countryside. And all this literature can and should be analyzed for what it shows about the social structure on the eve of the catastrophe. And then the literature written in the 30s should be analyzed to see if any patterns can be found. Unfortunately, I think no one has done this. The models to follow do exist. Vera Dunham is only one. There are methods of analyzing literature from a sociological point of view. This has not been done in the Ukrainian case.
Has there been any attempt to gauge or the percentage of the Soviet gross national product produced during the 1930s by forced labor?
Well, that's a very good question, but unfortunately I cannot answer that question.
I'm just wondering if
There might have been some
Could I briefly answer that? Yes, there have been such studies. They're forgotten today. They have been out of scholarly circulation for some time, but such studies have been published. Dallin did some work on the question of forced labor, and a number of economists active in the late 30s and 40s did work on that precise subject.
Let me just mention
conclusions on that?
pardon?
Could you quote perhaps the conclusions offhand?
I don't remember that now. I would have to refresh my memory. I have not given this subject any great attention, but I do know that such a body of literature exists.
Dallin's book is called Forced Labor in the USSR.
Yes.
Mind you, the size of this forced labor varied, but it was actually quite a substantial percentage of the labor force. And according to the estimates that in the late 30s, some estimates would have it 10 million people, others or 15 million people of forced labor at that time. So this was a significant part, and certainly must have made an impact on the economic structure in some way.
There is some fragmentary evidence that at least in some cases, the conflict in the village, in the countryside that took place during the years of collectivization, dekulakization, and the famine, the conflict between, on the one hand, the activists, the sexote, and on the other hand, the bulk of the peasants, that this conflict was, at least in some cases, based on the earlier religious conflicts between the various jurisdictions of the 1920s. And that personal revenge, personal conflict as to parish affiliation then became the ground on which revenge and various other acts took place during the years of the catastrophe. Unfortunately, the evidence is very fragmentary, but it would be interesting to try to establish the link there.
Usually, if somebody was arrested and then released pretty quickly, it was usually, I don't say it was always so, but usually it was so that he was recruited into Sexote and because of that released.
I should have mentioned that there was a sort of a double stage in development of Sexote. The first stage was, according to the sources, that one or so would be sent first, and their task was to develop a local group of Sexote, and they were supposed to come and recruit others, in fact, from the local scene. Then after, of course, they have done that, then they were supposed to provide quotas of names. Groups of people, a rather large population, I think, of the community who were recruited into this. And it was a factor, a new factor in the structure of society, which has remained for a long period to come, which in fact in the West we are not prepared to deal with. Not prepared to understand the kind of the secret levels of society which are around us and influence us in many ways, and we have no way of dealing them. But then it has become part and parcel of normal life of society.
In 1:30, immediately after.